Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Presumption. It's me, Sara, Jim, and Matt. Hi, guys.
Hey, Sara.
What's going on, guys?
How you doing?
Good. Excited to be talking to you guys. We got some great interviews lined up for you guys over the next few weeks. And I'm just saying that because we've been taping up a storm over here.
Right. And you need to subscribe on Spotify, Apple, give us stars.
Yeah.
Give us feedback, reviews, and also YouTube is a completely separate beast where you can watch the episodes. I'm more of a visual person, so I always like to watch things, not listen to things. So those of you like me, please go to YouTube and do the same. So today, Jim and I are going to talk to you about Kohberger. One thing I want to tell everybody, our listeners and viewers, is that this is not a news show. It's not live, and we're not doing stuff in real time. There are lots of obviously platforms that you could go to for that kind of information. But what we bring you is over 50 years of experience with these issues. And so when we take a deep dive in our crime toppers called Crime Time, or just in general in episodes, it's not necessarily because it just happened today in court, but it's more about a deeper sort of look into the issue. And so today, we're of course going to talk to you about some of the recent developments in Kohberger. The first one, Jim, was one of the motions to compel that the defense filed. They filed an affidavit by an IGG expert to support the relevance and materiality of the IGG file from the FBI and why they need that. And so we both have read that declaration. I just, read about all the wonderful experience this person has. And then I got to the very end, which is really the crux of this affidavit. What was your take on what this expert is saying and why the defense is introducing this in support of the motion to compel?
The expert has identified, actually 5 areas that she has seen problems with this IGG. It's called SNP profile, which is a little bit different from the standard DNA testing, which is STR, short tandem repeats. SNP is for something else. But in any event, there have been issues that she's personally aware of. And the defense is complaining that the door has been shut, so they cannot look behind the door to see how the IGG was developed in this case. And I think they have a very, 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 very strong argument that they're entitled to look behind the door. I was really intrigued and interested in one of her points in her affidavit where she says that she is aware of investigative genetic genealogists using security loopholes to see DNA kits who are opted out of forensic matching at GED match and family tree DNA, and that's something that I've raised is people signing up for these DNA ancestry sites. Some of them don't want their DNA to be cross-checked for criminal investigative purposes. And yet, here's what she's saying is they're doing it anyway. And so that's something that resonates with a lot of people is our private information being misused or abused by law enforcement without our permission? And I think that, I can't wait to see how the judge rules. I hope he rules.
Judge. We like the way you say judge.
I gotta say too,
judge. Yeah, I love me some judge.
For listeners who are kind of just joining us here at the Presumption, you should go back and listen to the interview we did with CeCe Moore, because I personally knew absolutely nothing about this IGG thing. Yeah. And that was such a fascinating interview. And as we've been recording more of these shows and we're diving more into the Kohberger case, it's really interesting how much of it is coming to rely on this really strange new science.
Well, it's also, I think, plain and simple, what Ann Taylor, the public defender for Kohberger, is saying is that it's not enough that the DA or the state does not want to introduce it at trial. It goes beyond identification, that it's actually it's almost like the fruit of the poisonous tree kind of theory, that without that IGG, you would not have been able to get to Kohberger and make a case, essentially, because remember, Jim, that his car was identified around the same time as this, what they're calling the FBI tip, the IGG. We don't know which one came first. Remember that the car was initially a white Elantra that was like 1 year make and model, and then it turned out to be a completely different one. And so what are they fudging? Why are they, are they backtracking? Because as we know, they do that. And also, plain and simple, when they're calling this an investigative tool, right? Defense is entitled to know what the investigation is when you're taking somebody's life and liberty away. And so, I guess my point here is that you're keeping this a secret, right? But it was part of the investigation. And so therefore, there's a specific protocol, like you said, that has to be followed. The FBI can only use certain databases or 2 databases. And so the defense needs to know that they actually did that they didn't go beyond that to other databases. And so I am just more and more seeing how desperately we need higher court rulings on this issue. Because right now we just have these little trial courts across the country essentially denying denying motions to compel. And so I think we need a bigger sort of Fourth Amendment fight over this that leads to some sort of higher court ruling, because otherwise,
and one thing, Sarah, we all need to ask ourselves, why is the state fighting this so hard?
Yeah.
What are they hiding? Or is it the FBI that's fighting this? Right. And if so, what are they hiding?
When you're fighting, you're hiding. When you're fighting, you're hiding.
Every litigation, with civil or criminal, when the other side doesn't want to give me something, I want it that much worse.
I know. Then I want it even more than I ever wanted it before, So there's definitely, they've tried to say that it's not material, it's not science, because they divorce the science from the SNP processing from the FBI family tree. But it's really all, without one, you don't have the other. It's all part of one unit. And so we'll see what happens, because the court is going to be hearing a bunch of motions, including this motion, and we'll see how it rules. The other issue was the alibi. Kohberger did put in a response to the prosecution's request for an alibi. Under Idaho rule, it has to be filed within a certain time from the trial date. Trial date still remains in October. And so he did produce an alibi, basically saying he was driving around in the late night hours of, before the murders and into the morning of the murders. And that he was just driving around. He doesn't say where he was driving. He doesn't have any witnesses. So he was driving alone, he says. And essentially says that by way of cross-examining the state's witnesses and other witnesses at trial, he might be able to support that alibi statement. Now, sure, it's not a traditional alibi like you and I typically think of. I was with Joe at this hour at his house. So you have Joe as a witness, you have a specific time, you have a specific location. It's far more generic. But I believe it's still an alibi because it places him somewhere other than at the crime scene during the window of the murders. Do you agree?
Sure. Now, what is on deck at this upcoming hearing is the state's motion to compel, saying that Kohberger's notice of alibi doesn't comply with the rule, and the rule requires you to give exact location, date, time, and witnesses. And what Kohberger has in his response to the state's motion, he says, his lawyers say that he has long had a habit of going for drives alone. Often he'd go for drives at night. He did so late on November 12th and into November 13th, 2022. And he's not claiming he was at a specific location at a specific time. He says, that's my alibi. If you tell me the exact second that, these murders took place, maybe I can give you a better time of where I was at that point in time. And that's sort of a, chicken or the egg point here. But again, Judge is going to, take a pass at this. I don't know that you can make a defendant give more than what Kohberger's already given. But, the remedy, if it is a violation, is to preclude the alibi defense if he takes the stand. I don't know that. I don't know that would ever happen, frankly.
I don't think so either. I think in the interest of justice, this is one of those things where even if it doesn't meet the statutory deadline, there is no way that a court would take the risk of getting somebody wrongfully convicted who later says, I have an alibi, I mean, I just don't see that happening. I actually brought this issue up to a few prosecutor friends, and they were saying, yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things where there's a deadline because there needs to be a deadline on things, but you don't want a trial by ambush, right? You want to give the prosecution the opportunity to do its investigation. But if you're eliciting that information in the course of trial through witnesses, I don't see how you can be precluded from presenting an alibi, because that's a huge reversible error, in my opinion, despite any deadline. So I think it was an alibi. I think it was smart because she did her sort of due diligence of like responding on time under the statutory mandate, but she also preserved the opportunity to later supplement that information, flesh it out, provide those other details that we're used to seeing in a traditional alibi. Anyway,
well, in the state's motion to compel, the state says, hey, we're set for trial in October. You can't be adding witnesses at the last minute.
Yeah.
Sarah, do you think we'll see a Kohberger trial in October?
Look, I've been saying no, just because of the breadth and magnitude of the case. But I'm a little bit confused. I need to think through why he has a stay in place so that he doesn't waive his sacrosanct right to a speedy trial. What is he waiting on? Is it this IGG stuff? Because if he gets the IGG stuff, he might make a motion to dismiss, to try to throw out the PCA. I don't know why it is that there's this stay, which is also going to be considered by the court because the prosecution doesn't want the stay in place anymore. So he hasn't waived time. And the trial is set for October. They're proceeding according to deadlines as though it's going in October. And so all I can think of is that what's keeping this sort of in limbo is this IGG stuff that's outstanding, because it does go to the PCA. And like I said, the car and the IGG were mysteriously, like, they surfaced around the same time, and the defense doesn't know which one came first, and it matters. And so I tend to think that Ann Taylor might want to be filing some sort of motion for dismissal or, challenging the PCA to where it gets thrown out. I mean, that's what I'm thinking. And that's why they asked to toll this, his speedy trial and not have to waive time. But listen, you went to trial on Murdaugh and it was unheard of. He gets indicted in the middle of summer and you go to trial the following January. And I'm like, like, that doesn't happen that often. But as I became more familiar with your case and I realized they had zero evidence in terms of forensic evidence of murder, I thought, this is brilliant. I would go to trial as quickly as you did. But as it turned out, they convicted not on murder, they convicted on financial character assassination. So sometimes you do go to trial, right, Jim? I mean, sometimes if you feel like the evidence sucks, like right now, I think Kohberger evidence sucks. It's not terrible against him. It's definitely defensible. If they have more, maybe they do. And if they have more, then obviously my opinion could change. But if Ann Taylor believes that this is all they got and all she really needs is the IGG, I mean, maybe there's a different plan in place.
Matt, I want to see if you've been paying attention to all these episodes. Sarah used PCA about 5 times. What does that mean?
I gotta tell you, when she was like IGG PCA, I'm like rolling through my brain trying to remember the acronym. I'm failing this test. I'm failing.
All right, Sarah.
Investigative genetic genealogy, which is also FGG, forensic genetic genealogy. And then what is PCA, Jim?
Probable cause affidavit.
I don't know if Sarah knows. She's throwing it to you now, Jim. Now it's circling.
Am I right? Probable cause affidavit. Is that right?
Or piece of crap
affidavit.
a-holes.
Yeah.
depending on the day. Anyway, we are going to take
and so the affidavit probable cause is important because that's the basis for search warrants and the whole, and if all that, if the probable cause affidavit is bad, then the searches are bad, then the evidence gets thrown out, and Kohberger walks, perhaps. So.
Yeah, and it's really the foundation of the case. So it's very important. So we're going to take a brief break, and please don't go away because we are going to be joined by an incredible author and journalist, Sam Quinones. Used to be with the LA Times, and you'll hear more about him. He has written two phenomenal and very critical books that everybody should read that we will talk about the fentanyl crisis and the opioid crisis in America. And he's going to spin off a series that we have for you guys with various guests regarding the fentanyl crisis. We will be speaking to a couple of prosecutors as well in the upcoming episodes. So please stay with us and we will be right back. All right, everyone, welcome back from a brief break. We are now joined by a very special guest. I always say this, but this time I really mean it. Sam Quinones. Welcome, Sam, to the Presumption.
Thanks very much for having me, guys. Appreciate the interest.
So Sam is a lot of things. He's a Los Angeles-based freelance journalist, a reporter for 35 years, and author of 4 acclaimed books of narrative nonfiction. Very important as we get to speak about them today. He's a veteran reporter on immigration, gangs, drug trafficking, the border, all the stuff that Jim and I deal with on the legal side. And, a New York Times bestselling author of Dreamland and his most recent book that I just finished reading, The Least of Us. He was a reporter.
I've got Dreamland right here, sir. So
yeah. Yeah. He was a reporter with the LA Times for 10 years. Before that, he made a living as a freelance writer residing in Mexico for a decade. His latest book, released in November 2021, is The Least of Us, True Tales of America and Hope in the Time of Fentanyl and Meth. In The Least of Us, he chronicles the emergence of a drug trafficking world producing massive supplies of synthetic drugs, fentanyl and meth, cheaper and deadlier than ever before, marketing to the population of addicts created by the nation's opioid epidemic, which is the subject of his first book. Sam broke the story of how the methamphetamine now produced in Mexico has covered the U.S. and is creating widespread and rapid onset symptoms of schizophrenia, becoming in the process a major driver in the country's homeless problem. I also happen to live in downtown LA, not too far from the LA Times. So I see this at play on the streets, day in and day out. But The Least of Us was nominated for a National Book Critics Circle NBCC Award for Best Nonfiction Book of 2021. The book follows his landmark work, Dreamland, as we talked about, which was published in 2015 about the opiate epidemic, which ignited awareness of the epidemic that has cost the United States hundreds of thousands of lives and become the deadliest drug epidemic in the nation's history. Dreamland won a National Book Critics Circle Award for the Best Nonfiction Book of 2015. And in 2019, Slate.com selected Dreamland as one of the 50 best nonfiction books of the last 25 years. GQ magazine also selected Dreamland as one of the 50 best books of literary journalism of the 21st century. I mean, we can go on and on and on about Sam, and we will because he's got so much to say about fentanyl and meth and everything in between. So Sam, you say that this is the end of recreational party drugs. So many people who take drugs because they want to have fun. Recently one of my goddaughter's best friends who just started going to Brown, very square kid, not really a partier, was just experimenting like we all have, back in our college days, and dropped dead because whatever he had was laced with fentanyl. So people are dying. People are dying of fentanyl at astonishing rates across the country, and it's terrifying for all of us. And so you have a lot of important things to say in your book and in The Least of Us, which I just finished. And we want to hear what you have to say about why we're in this situation. Is the fentanyl getting us addicted, or are these addicts who are just becoming addicted to fentanyl, which is obviously much stronger than black market opioids? And where are we headed from here? So I'm going to let you take over and tell
That's
us.
a whole bunch of questions. I don't think I can answer all of them in one spot, so you're going to have to break them up. But I think that the problem is really gotten down to the idea that that the Mexican trafficking world has figured out in the last number of years that it's a much better idea for them to make their drugs rather than grow them. They learned this from methamphetamine years ago, in which they began making in the late 80s and mastered and industrialized basically in the 1990s into the 2000s. And they learned that synthetic drugs are preferable. They're far easier to make. You don't rely on seasons or land or farmers or sunlight or any of that kind of stuff. What you need now, most of all, is access to shipping ports. That's really what matters most of all. Mm-hmm. And they control the shipping ports on the western side of the United States to the extent that they need to gather just catastrophic quantities of these ingredients that then they turn into fentanyl and methamphetamine. But they've learned this through methamphetamine first. Fentanyl came later, and then they realized that there was, in the middle of supplying our opioid epidemic that I talk about in Dreamland, supplying those customers addicted to pills with heroin. They realized that there was such a thing as what they called at the time synthetic heroin, which was really fentanyl. And they have mastered that. And so what you are seeing is something unprecedented in the history of drug use in our country in the last several years. And that is that one source, essentially the Mexican trafficking world, on the western coast of Mexico, in the states of Michoacan, Jalisco, Nayarit, Sinaloa, of course, parts of Chihuahua, and then up into the Baja California area. They have succeeded in creating supplies vast enough to cover the entire country. And so we've never seen this before from one general source. Even cocaine and crack did not do what these drugs are doing. There's almost no part of the country where these two drugs are not found. And what's more is they're found in, it's a remarkable thing because they are found in just terrible potency. Now, fentanyl is already very, very potent and very difficult to mix properly. Methamphetamine, though, has been made in quantities that are staggering, just unbelievable. And we do have a history of pricing for methamphetamine. And we're like lower prices for methamphetamine than we've ever seen in this country and nationwide. So it's a remarkable idea that this one area has produced so much of these two drugs that they now cover the country, and they at prices lower than we've ever seen before. And I will say this: it's kind of hard with fentanyl to discuss potency. It's such a potent drug; so a few little grains worth of sand of fentanyl will kill you. With methamphetamine, there's never been a time when we've seen such potent methamphetamine on the streets, much more potent than when the Mexicans were making it in the 1990s and so on. And so all of this has created enormous problems. It has created record overdose deaths, record overdoses, period, people getting revived off of overdoses, but then record overdose deaths. Yes. And I argue in the book that this is also creating enormous problems of mental illness. The methamphetamine, so potent and so prevalent, is creating problems of mental illness, and that is creating, adding to, or a major driver of, I would argue, our homeless problem and mental illness problem that we're seeing coast to coast, because the methamphetamine now is itself coast to coast.
Sam, you talk in your book, and I don't know whether it's Dreamland or The Least of Us. I've read both, and I recommend them to anyone who's listening, about supply and demand, and that fentanyl creates its own demand, and you attribute that to what you refer to as the morphine molecule. Can you explain what the morphine molecule is? Have you learned during your research?
Sure. I mean, the morphine molecule is different from the fentanyl molecule. The morphine molecule is the molecule found in opium and morphine and all the other opioids derived from morphine. Derived from opium, that attach to our opioid receptors in our brain. That's which controls pain. It can, if enough of it, you get euphoric feeling like you get with codeine or heroin or whatever.
And how does fentanyl attach? Maybe it's not the morphine molecule, but it has the same effect.
The guy who invented a new molecule that he saw. He was a brilliant chemist named Paul Janssen, a Belgian man, one of the great scientific minds of the 20th century, created numerous drugs that have benefited mankind. He saw that this certain kind of molecule would get quicker to our brains than the morphine, and in larger amounts. And so he thought, gee, if we can find a way of getting that in, that would be a huge advance over morphine. And he was right. Fentanyl is a magnificent drug used surgically. I've had it myself. Many of your listeners will have had fentanyl, whether they know it or not. In fact, it's one of the great anesthetics of our time, used properly, used in surgery.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons is because of what he discovered, that it'll go in and out. What he saw was that it'll attach to the receptor, the opioid receptor, and then leave very quickly. And that's what happens with fentanyl. When you're in surgery, you get quickly into anesthesia, and then when the surgery is over, it gets quickly out. As it happens, though, that's also what makes the drug a torment for users and the perfect drug for dealers, because you are always being pulled out of your euphoria, or always the drug withdrawals are right here. The beast is right here over your shoulder with fentanyl. You can never really go very long because of that very nature of the drug, of the molecule. And so you get people having to use on the street much more often. When you convert someone from a cocaine user who buys every weekend to a fentanyl user, you get someone who buys from you 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times a day. Whereas maybe if that person were a heroin addict, buy from you twice a day, maybe something like that, And so you get this real change in how often people need to use, and then very quickly the tolerances rise far, far, far beyond anything heroin would take you to. And so what you're finding is that there really is no more heroin on the streets of America, because heroin does not really calm the withdrawals.
Yeah.
You're addicted to fentanyl. And it's empowering. People using all day long because they are never very far away from the withdrawals with fentanyl.
I'm representing a very bad opioid addict who for many years was addicted to Oxy and then Oxy black market. And he describes, and he was he was buying fake Oxys from another guy but ultimately was coming from Mexico. And he said that, I was never told that it's fentanyl. He said, but there was this kick to it. And I guessed, that it's probably fentanyl because, everyone's talking about fentanyl. This was a few years ago. And he said that I just had a preference for that. And that I just didn't want the regular Oxys anymore, the regular ones that were not laced. And so, that's one of the questions I have, if is, are people dying because of, are they out to get fentanyl, or are most of these deaths associated with, people using what they think is cocaine or heroin or pot, even I've heard could be laced with fentanyl, and then they die from the fentanyl that's laced. Does that make sense?
There's both. You find both very frequently. And part of it is because the underworld has figured out that if you put fentanyl into meth, cocaine, marijuana, and now, of course, coming out of Mexico in the last several years, just scandalous quantities of fake pills that look like a Percocet or look like an oxycodone generic or whatever, a Xanax bar, but all contain nothing but fentanyl. Very quickly, you will get a fentanyl addict from someone who thinks she's buying a Xanax bar and wants to calm her anxiety because of COVID, being cooped up too long or whatever. On the other hand, there are many people who have now survived their first contacts with fentanyl. It happens. It's very common to survive the first and begin but very quickly develop an addiction to it. The body absolutely needs it. To say that he preferred fentanyl to, I don't think the verb prefer is the one anymore. At that point, it's you have to have.
It's not a choice.
You know, I was looking for fentanyl, couldn't find any, so I guess I'll just take some coffee.
Yeah, I know. Exactly. Hey, you know what's interesting? You mentioned that you were a reporter. I mean, you were a reporter in Mexico, I know, but and then, you know, you embark on these two very important books. You were the first person to shed light on the opioid crisis, and then other people started talking about it just because there's so much stigma around substance abuse, addiction. Nobody wants to really say, you know, I had a loved one who overdosed. And for you, did that journey in Mexico, I mean, did that have some connection with you? Because I've been to Mexico.
Sure, of course.
You know, what?
Of course, yeah. I mean, what happened was I had, when I lived in Mexico, I really didn't write about drugs. I was a freelance writer. I did not think the drug issue was very important, and I don't think it was back then.
Yeah.
This was 1994 to 2004. My main focus, really almost to obsession, was covering immigration and writing about immigration from small towns to various parts of the United States. I thought that was a much more important issue, that and political change in Mexico. I come back to the United States, get a job at the LA Times after 10 years, and within a short period of time, the drug war down in Mexico kicks off. Within a couple of years, gets very savage, alarmingly so. I never saw anything like that when I was living down there. It was just a remarkable thing of beheadings and people left in stack and piles at intersection. I mean, it's just a remarkable, scary thing. And it's really continued. The disintegrations continue. But along the way, I was put on a team of reporters to write about the drug war. And since I spoke fluent Spanish, lived in LA, my job was kind of what happens to drugs after they cross the border? How do they get? And so as part of that, I began to realize that we were seeing an enormous new increase in heroin use, which I could not explain. I did not understand why we would have more people using heroin. Didn't we go through this in the 70s?
Right.
Use heroin again. But along the way, I came upon this story of this town that I wrote about at great length in Dreamland, of this one town in Mexico in the state of Nayarit, right next to Sinaloa, where all the guys who come from that town come to the United States to sell heroin, black tar heroin, in a system that looks very much like pizza delivery. So you call, there's operators standing by, they dispatch drivers, the drivers have little balloons of black tar heroin in their mouths and hidden in their cars. And it's just this remarkable business. And it's all, and so I began to write, I began to dig into that. And at that point, I realized that they were all from the same town. What interested me about that was that as a reporter on the story of immigration and in small rural villages in Mexico in general, isolated villages where really there's not like a lot of connection to the rest of the economy, you find very, very commonly everybody in one town does the same job. It could be construction in Mexico City. It could be, there's all kinds of jobs that people will do en masse because there is no education that allows people to go to college and become, say, a a mechanical engineer. You learn your job from your uncle, your brother, your sister's husband, whatever it happens to be. And that's why in so many towns you find people all doing the same job. And for a lot of years, I was just used to this because you see this all the time with immigration. People immigrate at 16 and they all take the same job in, say, West Covina, California. They're all landscapers, they're all drywall hangers. It's very, very, very common. So when I've discovered that there was this one town where everybody sold heroin like pizza up in the United States, I knew that was a big deal. And so it was really more the immigration aspect to the story that got me onto it. Like, I know this, there's so many towns just like that. When someone told me, all these guys we arrest, they're all from the same town. And I'm like, I knew he was telling the truth. What I didn't know was all about the OxyContin, all that kind of stuff, the opioid epidemic, pain management, addiction, all of that had happened when I was in Mexico, and I was not paying attention to it when I was down in Mexico. And so that was my learning curve. But a lot of what I did in Mexico helped inform me. So when I heard someone tell me that they're all from the same town, it meant something very, very big to me, where it might not have meant something very big to another reporter.
Yeah, Sam, you touched on that, and it is, you go in depth about Purdue Pharma, the Sackler family, and the and the marketing of oxycodone and OxyContin, and how that in medicine, there became a time when in medical school they were taught that we were not treating pain aggressively enough.
Right.
Purdue Pharma was out taking on new marketing techniques to convince doctors that it's important to get a smiley face for pain, and then there was a realization in the medical community that we are creating addicts, and so they started pulling back, and they left a lot of people, good people in blue collar towns who were taking a prescription OxyContin, and then they couldn't get it anymore. And then they turned to, black tar heroin. And that seems to be my takeaway of your book, Dreamland. I mean, there's a whole lot more to it, but you describe in the communities how there's this gap of, Purdue Pharma doctors following, aggressive prescription practices and then pulling back. And then you've got these people out there who are addicts, and in that void, you have this black tar heroin come in.
I think what is important, though, I would say one of the things that really changed when I was writing all this, and was confirmed later by the stuff I wrote about fentanyl and the reporting I did about fentanyl and methamphetamine, is that particularly when it comes to opioids, could be heroin, could be fentanyl, could be codeine, whatever it is, it's almost always about supply creating demand, not the other way around. And that is what the opioid epidemic was, the first example of that. Just massive pills unleashed on the population and marketed according to a template that was really established by Purdue Pharma. That was their business model. You get doctors prescribing even at the smallest doses, and eventually those small doses will create more demand, and you will have that person who you started on 5 milligrams of OxyContin will soon be at 40 or 80. They knew this. This was a business model that now we know, if we didn't before, because you are seeing a lot of subpoenas, have seen a lot of subpoenas by attorneys general around the country. I would say very interestingly out of Massachusetts, that show internal memoranda emails, which shows that they understood. You just get people using and keep pushing. The key to it was relentless visits to doctors. Do not leave the doctors alone for 2 weeks to have second thoughts. And that's also why they marketed OxyContin in 5 and 10 milligram doses, because it was a good entry way. They gave away, discount cards, and you get your first five weeks free, and all this. They knew that if you market it, the opioids will do the job for you because they have such powerful effect on all of our brains. And even if you have really almost no genetic disposition for addiction, if you use these pills for 90 days, I think is what the studies have shown, maybe 100 days, something like that, you will be using it 5 years later. There was a awful story, frankly, I heard from a woman I met in Eastern Tennessee a while ago, and she told me that she was prescribed by a doctor, Oxycontin or Vicodin, I don't remember which now, for a foot rash. Now, nowhere in medicine is there any suggestion that you should use opioids for a foot rash. I think this doctor was later decertified. But that opened her up to an entire 20 years of the most awful, life-mangling addiction. She lost her child. She got huge sores on her feet. I mean, it's the story that went. But what I realized as I was talking with her is that this was a woman who almost had no other disposition for addiction. She didn't drink. We were eating breakfast. She didn't drink coffee. She didn't smoke. She didn't eat lots of sugar. I mean, there was almost nothing. She didn't smoke marijuana. She didn't do any other drug. It was a woman who had apparently no genetic disposition for addiction, and yet grew addicted because she was just blasted with these drugs by this quack doctor.
Sam, when I was reading your book and you described, there were a number of pill mill or doctors that were really overprescribing, and they became magnets that where addicts would go to, and I was looking for the one in Myrtle Beach. It's not in your book. You have some in Kentucky and in the coal regions, but in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, we had a huge pain clinic where they had buses coming in from Mississippi and everywhere for people to come get their OxyContin, and some people were getting it for resale, but there were a lot of addicts, and the DEA shut them down in the early 2000s. And it was shortly after I'd left the U.S. Attorney's Office, and we filed a class action lawsuit. And you talk about a lawyer who tried to do the same thing in some other part of the country. And we got into the discovery at Purdue Pharma, and we saw how Purdue Pharma can track doctors' prescribing practices, and they know how many 80s and how many 60s that doctors are prescribing, and they'll send their drug reps in to push.
I think they knew all that. They had data showing that even predating the release of OxyContin. They had data showing that in some parts of the country, I think they were using almost as a barometer. If you were a doctor prescribing lots of diet pills, I mean, a lot of times in certain areas anyway, doctors were people you went to for all kinds of problems. It wasn't just medical issues. These were times when the economy was unraveling, when coal mines were closing, when factories were closing, and there just was so you went to doctors for workers' comp signatures and all these kinds of things, and so they knew they had data showing that, and I think that's where they directed. They did not have the largest sales force in the drug industry. So they had to pick and choose. They did not have enough to send them all over the country. So they had to pick and choose. And they chose those areas like Appalachia, like Maine, New Mexico, places like that, I think, where people were showing that they were in kind of real distress. And one of the barometers was how often doctors prescribed almost any kind of pill. But I think I remember diet pills being one because people were dealing with obesity and that kind of thing. Speaking of Myrtle Beach, the guys from Nayarit had, the last time I spoke with cops in Myrtle Beach, they were on their 6th iteration of the guys now this was several years ago.
Right.
6th iteration, meaning that they had arrested 6 generations of black tar heroin traffickers from Myrtle Beach. The way they got to Myrtle Beach was because they were in Tennessee, and one crew was in Memphis, and somehow they contacted a they got in touch with a long-term heroin addict. I can't tell you his name, but I know who he is, and I know I've got information on him. Who told them, and who was like very appreciative of their very potent black tar heroin, and told them, you need to go to Myrtle Beach. He had some connection out there, and he was the one who first introduced the Nayarit boys to the Jalisco boys to Myrtle Beach, and then 6 generations of arrests and arrests and arrests. And, you know, people would be making the arrests and be filing the case, and the phones would come back on, and they say, okay, we're coming back in business in another week. Hang tight, and we'll be with you in a minute. You know, that kind of.
Yeah, and so we ended up suing when we had a class action. We had the class representatives and folks, you know, and every class representative that we had pretty much would relapse, and they would go on heroin. They would get arrested, and they would be the worst type of class representative you could have. And our civil lawsuit was just falling apart. We had a few death cases, and so that helped us go forward. And then one day we get a call from it's Feinberg, who's a nationally famous arbitrator, mediator. He did 9/11 fund, and so Purdue Pharma wants to talk to y'all about settling the case. And we're like, oh, please do, because, you know, all our class reps were falling apart, and they were all getting arrested, and they're all back in rehab, and they were just having a real struggle with their life. And we ended up working out a magnificent settlement, and we thought we were the smartest lawyers in the world, able to settle a case with some really bad class reps. And the day we got our settlement approved in South Carolina courts, and we got the money wired in, it was many, many, many millions of dollars for drug treatment and things of that nature. The next day, Purdue Pharma, and you've got it in your book, goes into federal court and pleads guilty to misbranding and their executives. And so I was a little bit upset that the U.S. Attorney's Office, they allowed Purdue Pharma to settle all the civil cases before they took a guilty plea. And that's,
right.
Money talks.
I ran into that same problem that same issue when I was writing Dreamland, and that is lawyers would tell me we can't file a class action suit because our plaintiffs are all of the worst kind. They'd be picked apart horribly on the stand, and they have long records, and, you know, on and on like this. They're not, you know, and so I remember thinking when I was writing Dreamland that I would be in these neighborhoods that were really beset by OxyContin and that kind of thing, and opioid addiction, and thinking to myself, there's no way people in this neighborhood are ever going to get any kind of accounting from Purdue Pharma. That because also I was finding that nobody wanted to talk about this topic, right? Yeah. So then Dreamland comes out, 2015, and my wife and I are just getting ready to, you know, to like beg people to read it and this kind of thing. And what begins to happen right then, and I live this, this is part of my personal story and all this, is that all of a sudden you begin to see the awakening of people and people who were terrified about talking to me publicly or talking to anybody publicly about their loved one who was addicted or died or whatever. Now they're in the shadows. They're living in hell because they can't talk to anybody about it. And they put on a smile when what they really should be doing is crying a lot, you know. These folks begin gradually over the next several years, more and more of these people begin to come out of the shadows. And what you then begin to see is the stories begin to be told that should have been told 10 years prior, but did not. And I lived this full time. I began getting invitations to come speak all over the country. It was amazing. Mm-hmm. I just was certain before, when I was writing Dreamland, nobody mentioned the cause of death in obituaries. Nobody knew how to pronounce naloxone. Everyone was like living in their own little silent world, you know? Yeah. And then all of a sudden, the book comes out, and I just began to feel it. And you began to see a few lawsuits. Everett, Washington was one of the first, I remember. Then there's some others, then some tribes. And then pretty soon, boom, it was like, you know, hundreds of lawsuits, then thousands of lawsuits. Then I think really importantly in all this, the political movement kind of was created so that attorneys general, each in turn, got into the business of suing Purdue, Johnson & Johnson, the other ones. But then in the case of Massachusetts, of actually naming the Sackler family. And when they did that, they brought all those very experienced investigators, subpoena power, and dislodged all of those emails that I, as a reporter, lowly freelance guy with almost no budget, could never hope to get. Now, all of a sudden, and that's why in The Least of Us, there are 5 chapters in the book about the Sacklers, because I wanted to at least recognize some of the story that had been dislodged through these subpoenas that I had never had a chance to look at.
Right.
Would as a reporter, as a freelance reporter with nobody behind me. Now all of a sudden, the subpoenas of the AGs are getting that done, and it's really remarkable. And that is where you begin to see the real story of how the Purdue Pharma business model was inundate supply, market the hell out of the doctors, and that will create demand.
And Sam, you
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, Sarah, I'm sorry. I'm stepping all over you today, but in The Least of Us, you talk about, and you do, you describe it as, compare it to the discussion about AIDS. And so the taboo has come off of addiction to heroin and fentanyl deaths. And these are principally families who are white middle class. I mean, this is this is who have been affected by drug addictions, and they're the people who didn't want to talk about it. And Dreamland brought the discussion to the forefront. And you describe that even in red states, that meaning Republican states, Republican politicians were not getting elected unless they had a political platform of treating addicts instead of
it changed the politics of red areas. I think in many red areas very completely. In a lot of ways, I would say that people used to say, well, this is only being recognized now because it's white middle class people, and I would say no. It wasn't recognized for at least a decade, maybe more, because it was white middle class people, because they didn't want it. Right? They didn't want their kid to be known as an addict, or their uncle to be known as a heroin addict, and that kind of thing. And so they kept it quiet. And it was when they finally, after many years, came out of the closet, so to speak, came out of the shadows to talk about it, then you begin to see a lot of issue. However, with fentanyl now, fentanyl and meth change everything, right? And fentanyl now has brought the African American community into the fentanyl, into the opioid epidemic. When I wrote Dreamland, it was principally a white and Native American problem. That was pretty much it. Now with fentanyl being mixed into cocaine being a major drug of choice in the Black community, people are dying in outrageous numbers of fentanyl that they was laced into the cocaine.
Mm-hmm.
Sarah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no worries. I lost my train of thought, but I have a lot of questions. We're also seeing, Sam, in the criminal justice system, a pretty obvious shift. There used to be a time when a lot of my clients were doctors who were prescribing OxyContin, and, I think that the deterrent factor worked with all the years in prison that a lot of doctors got in the system. And meth, of course, I've had a lot of huge meth cases, a lot of it coming from China, a lot of it from Mexico. But I feel like now, because fentanyl is killing us, and meth doesn't kill us, it destroys us, it degrades us, but doesn't kill us. That our focus is obviously fentanyl because we're so terrified. And it's in the criminal justice system too. Some of the harshest punishments are associated with fentanyl distribution. And by the way, unlike the other types of cases Jim and I have defended, meth and oxy and all that, where we were defending large sort of suppliers getting stuff from Mexico. Fentanyl, most of my clients are themselves addicts. They just gave one pill. And, this one client I have right now, he keeps saying, well, I took it and I didn't die. I took the same pill from the same batch and I didn't die. How come she died? So it's just a mixed bag, but it's really, you see a different sort of demographic of defendants that themselves are afflicted with addiction, that wasn't so much the case with these other drugs. But I want to talk to you about meth. You speak about meeting with a homeless advocate who talks about meth being in every homeless encampment. Like I said, I live in downtown, and a lot of homeless, depending on what time of day, are around my building. And they are mentally ill. It's obvious. And I don't know, there's an ongoing debate about this person needs medication. Instead, they're self-medicating with meth, or it's the meth that has made the person crazy, right? I mean, it's definitely palpable. It's obvious.
I think it's both. And these are, homelessness is a very individualized thing, it seems to me. I would not want to talk about it and say it's this or it's that. That's why I say it's a major driver in homelessness. But there are many things, there are many reasons why people become homeless. If you age out of the foster care system, it's very easy to become homeless after that because you just don't have any family, right? Mm-hmm. There's many ways, but I would say a couple of things. Certainly one reason people fall into homelessness is drug addiction. And now, particularly with again, I get back to the supplies, the potency and prevalence of these supplies of these two drugs is just so catastrophic for so many people in so many ways. And one way is they create addiction by their very presence. They're always there, always available. But there's another thing that happens, and that is because of their prevalence, because of their potency, when people fall into homeless for whatever reason, for many other reasons could be, it's very easy to start using these drugs. Sometimes it actually makes sense to start using these drugs. Meth keeps you up.
Well, Sam, I was just telling Jim this morning, a couple of days ago, actually, we were talking about this interview, and I was telling him I have a client. He calls himself a homeless millionaire, literally. His father put a trust for all of his kids, but he's homeless. He's been living on the streets for 5 or 6 years, and he doesn't get to participate in any of the family resources until he cleans up. So he's a homeless millionaire. But he says to me, I went to visit him in jail, and I said, you heroin, this and that. And he said, oh no, I've been clean. I haven't been using. And I said, well, I just got word from your brother who saw you on the streets that you were using meth recently. And he said, oh, meth? Oh, of course. I mean, meth, I'm on the streets. I have to use meth. It was such a given to him that for me, it was really weird to hear, because it was almost like, he was telling me like being homeless means you use meth. I mean, that's just
right. And what that means is that it takes you to a place mentally where it's very difficult to get out of homelessness. Not just mentally, but certainly mentally. There's other things involved as well. But it's such you dig yourself this very, very deep hole that you're already in with being homeless, and getting out of that's going to be tough. Now with meth driving you a little nuts. And also the fact, I don't know what your friend says, but I have heard several people tell me, and whatever in LA particularly, that it's almost free on the street. That's just a reflection of how much of it is out there, and so it's very, very difficult to get away from. But it's also like part of the reason, homelessness is part of the reason why you use it. Yes, because it keeps you up. It revs your body so you can protect yourself from the cold. For women, you can better defend yourself against rape and beatings. On and on and on. You keep your stuff from being stolen, which is a rampant thing in the homeless world, stealing of one's stuff. So all of this is part of what creates the problem of homelessness. And even when it doesn't create that homelessness, it certainly perpetuates.
Yeah.
And you're talking about the supply is so prevalent and so potent again.
What is this new form of, you mentioned this in your book, we used to take Sudafed and make meth from it, or methamphetamine, whatever. Now there's a new, as a P2P.
No, it's not a new thing. It's an old thing, but it's new to the trafficking world in Mexico, relatively new. So P2P was a method for making meth that the Hells Angels used to use in the 60s. And I think if you watch the Rolling Stones documentary, "Gimme Shelter," about their concert in Altamont, you will see Hell's Angels on this kind of meth. But P2P meth is not a really great way to make methamphetamine because it's very messy. It's more complicated than the ephedrine method, and it requires a lot more chemicals. It stinks, et cetera, et cetera. It does have, however, one benefit that has been of enormous utility to the trafficking world in Mexico, and that is, unlike ephedrine, P2P is easy to make in many, many different ways, all using chemicals that are industrial, very easily available, legal, cheap, and toxic. And so you get all these, so the government cannot crack down. Mexican government in 2008 cracked down on fentanyl, I'm sorry, on methamphetamine by controlling supplies of ephedrine that it was allowing to be imported into the country. With that, the trafficking world switched to this old but new to them method of making methamphetamine. And so when they did that, it took them a while to actually learn how to do it, and for the expertise to spread among people who are not chemists, of course, right? And to understand that they now were more reliant than ever on the different chemicals coming in from abroad, principally China, and through those ports. But eventually, by 2011, 12, 13, right in there, they are really mastering it, and more people are saying, "Hey, this is a great way to make some money. So I'm going to go sell it. I'm going to go make it." And you begin to see a lot of people in meth cooks, and then labs, and then things that go well beyond labs. They're very large. And then what begins to happen is you see this enormous spread of the drug, and that erases and drives to extinction all the meth cooks. There are no more meth cooks in America working, meth cooks. They're all gone. There's none of that anymore because they cannot compete. They cannot get chemicals cheap enough. They really don't know how to industrialize. You can't really industrialize the production of meth in Mexico, in the United States. The law enforcement will be all over you. And so what ends up happening is they just give up, and the meth comes in. And so the meth that is across the country now at, as I said earlier, record low prices is all coming in from Mexico relentlessly. It's not a wave. It's like a very new high tide. That's what it's better thought of as. Along the way, though, for reasons I think that are still being debated, but I think I've changed my thinking a little bit on this, it has been creating these symptoms of schizophrenia, this stuff coming out of Mexico now. Why? Well, initially when I wrote the book, nobody was talking about this. Nobody had written about this. This was like brand new stuff. I said, well, perhaps, I don't know why, that's what I said in the book, but perhaps it's because of all those toxic chemicals. I think now, after a couple of years of discussion and people, testing and all this kind of, what they're probably, people who are smarter than I am are suggesting is that probably it's simply that the traffickers are simply making such potent methamphetamine. And because there's so much of it, nobody is cutting their methamphetamine in the United States. Why would you cut it? The two reasons why you want to cut your drug is to extend its life, so you have more of a scarce drug, and so you want to sell it longer, or you want to increase the profitability. But if you want to extend there's no need to extend the life of the drug because you can get it anywhere now. And if you start cutting it with adulterants, then your customers are going to go somewhere else. And so what you're seeing is probably the most potent meth ever visited on the human brain, 99% meth. What you're getting is when you're holding that in your hand, that shard of glass or whatever, that is 99% meth. Ephedrine stuff, it was more like 35, 40, 50%. That is most likely the most potent meth that has ever been visited on the human brain in the history of that drug, which goes back to early part of the last century.
I haven't represented any drug users in quite some time, but I do remember a couple of times in the last 15 years where it'd be the son or daughter of a parent who had hired me to represent them, and you could tell if they were on meth because it looked like their eyes were hollow, their teeth were bad. It's like they had no soul, and there was no way for them to get off the meth of that day, 15 years ago, frankly, without going to jail. and I know drugs are in jail, but fact of the matter is, it's hard as hell to get off opioids, get off meth, and what's the way out? And I'm a huge fan of your book, Sam, both of them, and I've got dog-eared pages on all of them. But you have a line in the afterword of Dreamland, and you're quoting a prosecutor, and it says it's kind of a cliche that we cannot arrest our way out of this problem. One prosecutor told me, well, we can't treat our way out of the problem either. We're never going to solve the heroin epidemic on the back end, incarceration or treatment. A sobering thought and probably correct. I mean, that's kind of depressing, but I mean, but
it also has to do with the idea, I think, it's not entirely true that I do believe that law enforcement has a role that we have backed away from in the last few years. Because the drug war was a failure, we should not use law enforcement for anything. And I think that is completely wrong. I just think there's absolute nonsense to think that way. The problem with the drug war, as I've said before, is not that we use law enforcement, it's that we only use law enforcement, right? And we tried to use opioids to eradicate all pain. One tool to deal with something originating in the central nervous system of our brain, a very, very, very complex organ or system. And to me, that is when you get into problems. You use one tool. That's why I think it's a very important thing to use to begin in jail. Yeah, we need to start arresting people. There's no such thing as a minor drug charge anymore. If you have a little meth pipe, or you have a pipe and you're smoking a pill on foil, that is not the same as 20 years ago when you had a little baggie of marijuana. This is a life and death thing. Yeah. So what I think is what I was writing about in the least of us is some one county in particular, but others do this, is counties where they are really developing jail as a place of recovery. So that guy said there's drugs in all jails. Yes, there are, except in the recovery pods there are no drugs. Right. And that's when they're done well. Okay, so you can do them poorly. You can do anything well, you can do them poorly. But when they're done well, there's really no drugs in those pods. It's about reinforcing that positivity and that idea of being in, and then of course developing, which is what they've done in this one county in Kentucky, a whole continuum of care after jail. It doesn't matter what you do in jail if you don't have something to follow through. I think this is actually, if we'll listen to the lessons of the opioid epidemic, fentanyl and meth, this is actually a beautiful moment to rethink and think in terms of addiction, which we all can be a victim of, and that we can then develop an entire continuum of care, like I have from a heart attack. Diabetes has a continuum of care. Cancer has a continuum. Why not addiction? I think that this is, and when you do that, end up involving the entire community. I really do believe this is not something where we say, no, this one group can't be involved or they're bad. I think it's nonsense. And I think it's really important to understand that we have an opportunity, particularly with all this money that's coming out, to begin to construct continuums of care in community counties and towns all across this country, something we have had in medicine for years and never had for addiction.
That's one of the things I love about most about your book is that it doesn't just put the problem, shed light on the problem, put it in our face and sort of leave us with this deadly problem. You actually suggest a very real and important solution, which is, the power of connection. And when you look at any sort of program of recovery, at the top of the list is the 12 steps. It's all about community and connection. And so that formula definitely works. And that, what you're describing is inclusion, I think is something that would help everyone and hopefully destigmatize this a little bit. I do have one last question before we let you go.
Sure.
There's truth to the idea that we all have our vices. We say this all the time. But you actually dive into the neuroscience of addiction, and you go so far as to say that all of us have the capacity to be addicted to something, like everybody does, which, is kind of could be alarming to some people. So that means
we all have the brain chemistry,
I see,
reward pathways to allow that can be hijacked. And in fact, today, I would argue that in our lifetimes, we have seen this. We have seen the drugification of so much of legal stuff and services and goods, right? So instead of a cup of coffee, you get a frappuccino that's like a foot tall with fat and sugar and caffeine. Oh, you get now, instead of having to go to a casino, you can gamble in the darkness of your own home on whether the next guy up gets a double.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, now you have chicken nugget. Chicken is a magnificent source of protein, healthy source of protein. Now you have chicken nuggets, which are not. I mean, they're probably a source of protein, right, but there's salt, fat, and then you dip in the sugar too. You get on, and then social media and the phone, and then you get video games, on and on. We have seen so much of this stuff. And so I'm just amazed that, we can all be addicted. We can all be that addict eating from the trash.
Right.
Anybody, it just depends on a life experience and what you are exposed to. I would say that nowadays there's so much more that we can be addicted to: sex, shopping, all these things that are like good and wholesome in certain contexts become poisonous and toxic. You know what I mean? And we have seen, in your and my lifetime, we have seen this transformation within the American economy, certainly within the American economy. I would also,
there's got to be a, there's a happy medium to every sort of consumption.
We don't know where that is.
Yeah.
You know where that is.
Yeah. Well, why?
Well, I mean, I think it's because in our I would say this: I have a very dubious view of the ability of the American economy and American culture, business culture, to legalize drugs safely, maturely, responsibly. We're not doing it with marijuana. And why? Because we do not say, and this gets to the answer to your question, I think, and that is because we do not say no easily to large conglomerations of power and money. And so give them an inch, take a mile. And Purdue Pharma and the opioid epidemic is a perfect example of that. But, these gambling apps, why on earth are we allowing gambling apps on TV? We don't allow tobacco, just as addictive. We do not say no. We look at it as some kind of like, we're stepping on the God-given right of every business to earn a lot of money. In California, I don't know about in other states, but in California, there is literally it is legal to sell marijuana that has been grown indoors. Do people not get that there's climate change? We do not have the luxury of growing a weed that grows very well outside in the garden, indoors, with the carbon footprint of all that. It's insane, but we will not say no. When big business or small business or somebody gets a kind of a groovy vibe going in the economy, and everyone says, I got to do that. And we do not say no. You can do that legally, but you can't grow it at more than 10% THC, and you definitely can't sell it if you grow it indoors. And what's more, it's illegal to grow it indoors because we have climate change. But, ask yourself these questions. Why is all this happening? I think it's just because we don't do a good job as a culture of standing up to those powerful influences.
One last thing, Sam, and this resonated with me so much in the afterward of Dreamland, and you talk about how the coddling of America, how parents would coddle our children. Our kids today don't grow up like we grew up, where we just get on a bike, we'd leave, we'd come back for dinner time, and that we want our children to be pain-free. We want everyone to be pain-free, and we don't allow them to suffer and get hurt. And in your conclusion of your afterward, you say, I believe more strongly than ever that the antidote to heroin is community. If you want to keep kids off heroin, make sure people in your neighborhood do things together in public often. Form your own dreamland and break down those barriers that keep people isolated. Don't have play dates. Just go out and play. Bring people out of their private rooms, whatever forms those rooms take. And then you go on to say the antidote to heroin may well be making your kids ride bikes outside with their friends and letting them skin their knees. And then at the very end, you say, we may think heroin someday. And it's, it'd be the impetus for changing our culture. As to
I wrote that in a fit of naivete and optimism, I guess. I haven't seen that the way I'd like to see it, I guess, but it's true. I think that, forget pain. Parents are upset when their kids have to suffer some kind of disappointment.
Right. Yeah.
Disappointment is, we tried very, very hard as a couple to postpone the day when our little daughter got a smartphone. 6th grade, she was the only one without. 7th grade, she was the only one without. 8th grade started, she was the only one without. 2.5 years, finally at Christmas, we got her a smartphone. And I just thought that's way too young. But we couldn't postpone it because it was really affecting her social life. There's a lot of reasons why we had to do it, but I was really upset at that. She should have been 16 before she got one of those things, It's just, we are so terrified of our children facing and dealing with disappointment, let alone pain. Nobody really wants to, when you have life-mangling pain, obviously you need that dealt with. That's not something that you say, well, you should just deal with it. But pain and then disappointment, I don't know. To me, that feels like where we are as a culture. We just don't want our kids to feel that's why you give everybody a trophy on the Little League team, right?
Right.
But I also think there's a lot of stigma around. We grapple with the stigma around mental illness,
yes.
And the idea that we're depressed, we should be taking medication, but instead we self-medicate with drugs and alcohol and all kinds of stuff. And so I just think, unfortunately, it's 2023 and we're not there yet. I always say, okay, you have a cough, you take cough medicine. If you have some sort of depression, anxiety, you got to go get it treated, and I have it in my own family. And so it's just, we run to the escape, I think, more than the treatment.
And I think there's this idea that and my wife talks about this. She's a behavioral change consultant. She's very good at this. We talk about how there's this feeling like we should never be in a state of apprehension or disappointment, and yet that's how we were. Our brains were built that way. We were built to always be kind of like doing this. It should not be one thing and never anything else. And I just don't think that that's healthy. I think exactly what you say. It's like there's this idea like if something's bothering you, they need to be medicated immediately.
Right.
And I think if you don't have to look too far before you find the roots to what we've been talking about earlier in my 2 books and what we're talking about right now.
Yeah.
Sam,
go ahead.
What's your next book? What are you working on?
I'm worn out. I have to tell you, I don't know exactly. I'm trying to do stories that are shorter. So It doesn't take me 4 years to see my name in print. It takes me more like 4 months, that kind of thing. So we'll figure out what that might be. I'm kind of thinking though that I want to move away from opioids and fentanyl and heroin and all that kind of stuff and do something. I didn't become a journalist because I wanted to be Mr. Dope. I want to write about all kinds of things, very wide ranging. And I think I have in most of my career. People know me mostly because of these last 2 books, which is very nice. And I'm very, very grateful for their interest and that the books have done what they set out to do in a lot of cases. But I want to be a journalist that writes about just, you name it, I'll write about it. What a great journalist said, journalism is not about writing about what you know. Mm-hmm. It's about writing about what you don't know, and you're going to find out all about it. And to me, that's the great joy of journalism. And I hope to continue that.
I cannot thank you enough for joining us, Sam. I had to chase you down. I appreciate you taking the invitation. And all our viewers are so appreciative to hear from you. So thank you for joining us. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, guys. Thanks for the interest in the work. Really, really appreciate the chat.
Thank you. And at this point, I think it's time to rest, is it not?
Yep, we rest.